I never imagined that a simple favor watering a stranger's flowers, while she was away, would lead me into a connection deeper than any I'd ever known. What started as a quiet summer routine grew into something gentle, intimate, and unexpectedly transformative. And all it took was one heartfelt sentence to change both of our lives forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. If this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now, the first time I stepped through the creaky side gate of the IVHI-covered home on Maple Hollow Lane, the air smelled like jasmine and fresh-cut grass. I had just moved into the neighborhood a week before, boxes still stacked in corners, dishes barely unpacked, and when my neighbor from across the street, Miss Eleanor, had asked if I wouldn't mind watering her garden while she visited her sister in Oregon. I agreed without hesitation. I wasn't expecting much from it. Just a quick morning task to earn some neighborly goodwill, maybe a thank you pie when she returned. The house was beautiful in a vintage storybook kind of way, the kind you imagine in slow Sunday morning daydreams. Pale green shutters, a wraparound porch with a wind chime that sang every time the breeze picked up. But it was the garden that really stole your breath. Raised beds overflowing with snapdragons and delphiniums, roses coiling up the trellises like dancers in an eternal waltz. Whoever had planted this space had done it with care, precision, and a kind of gentle hope I hadn't felt in years. At the time, I didn't know what drew me back every morning beyond obligation. I told myself it was the peace of it, the solitude. A moment in my day that didn't involve moving boxes or answering emails, or remembering why I moved to a quieter town in the first place. I didn't know her Eleanor, but could see the kind of person she was through this garden. Tender, thoughtful, orderly, but with enough wildness around the edges to keep things interesting. For someone who'd been through a rough couple of years, who had just closed a chapter in a fast-paced city life that never quite fit right, those garden visits felt like medicine. And so, even when the sprinklers were set to run automatically, I came anyway. A week passed, then 10 days. I began to notice little things: a missing garden gnome one morning that reappeared the next. A wind chime slightly shifted, like someone had nudged it from the inside. I began to wonder if maybe she had returned early, quietly, without anyone noticing. So when I saw her for the first time on that 11th morning, standing barefoot on the porch, wrapped in a long white cardigan, with her graying hair loosely pinned, I was startled. But she didn't seem alarmed at all. In fact, she looked like she had been expecting me. "You're early," she said, her voice soft like the rustling petals in her flower beds. "And you water like someone who's trying to heal something." Sat on the porch steps that morning, sipping sweet tea she insisted on brewing, even though I told her I didn't want to trouble her. Eleanor, as it turned out, had returned a day early, hoping to slip into her house unnoticed so she could have a quiet moment before the world caught up with her. She had watched me from the upstairs window the past few mornings, surprised to see I came even after the job was technically done. "I figured you had your reasons," she said with a small smile. "And besides, the roses haven't looked this happy in weeks." That was the beginning. I didn't know then that she was recently widowed, or that she had lived in that house for over 30 years with her husband, Gerald, and that every flower in the garden had been planted by them together, season after season. I didn't know that this garden was the last living testament of their shared life, but I could feel that something about this place mattered. Something about her did too. There was an unspoken fragility in the air that morning. It's not sadness. Exactly, more like the pause that follows an exhale. The moment when the world holds still before it starts again. From that day on, I visited more than just in the mornings. We shared lunch on the porch a few times a week. I helped fix a wobbly trellis post and rewired an old outdoor lamp that hadn't worked in years. She showed me pictures of her life with Gerald black hand-white prints in vintage frames, smiling faces in front of mountains and lakes. And over time, I started to tell her about mine, about my recent divorce, about the business I left behind, and the silence that followed. She listened like no one else had. With curiosity, not pity. With patience, not advice. She had a way of talking that was both poetic and grounded. Like someone who had read every great novel but still knew how to bake perfect cornbread. It's the kind of woman you'd find equally at home in a garden or giving. A TED Talk. Her presence made me feel seen in a way I hadn't realized I was missing. Not romantic at first, just ... safe. One afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the tall hedges and lit her white cardigan in a golden hue, she asked if I wanted to stay for dinner. I hesitated, then nodded. We cooked together in the kitchen. She handed me a cutting board and laughed when I tried to julienne carrots. She made a stew from scratch, said it was Gerald's favorite. And as the stew simmered and the house filled with the scent of thyme and onion and something warm I couldn't name, I realized I hadn't felt this kind of peace in a very long time. That night, after we ate and she poured a bit of wine, Eleanor leaned back in her chair and looked at me not with longing but with a kind of clarity. You know, she said, almost to herself, it's funny how some things bloom again, just when you think the season's over, and maybe it was the wine, or the golden hour light filtering through her lace curtains. Or maybe it was something deeper. But I knew in that moment that I wasn't just watering her garden anymore. I was beginning to water something else entirely, something inside both of us. I don't remember exactly when the visits became routine or when I started planning my afternoons around them, but soon enough, it was just what I did. I'd swing by the nursery down the road, pick up a flat of marigolds or petunias, and show up on Eleanor's porch like it was the most natural thing in the world. She never asked for anything, never expected, but always welcomed me with that same calm grace that made everything else in life feel a little less sharp around the edges. The garden, once just a collection of vibrant colors and scents, started to feel like a conversation between the two of us each new bloom. Each weed pulled a silent note in a growing symphony. There was a rhythm to our days, unspoken but clear. And I began to understand that healing doesn't always come in the form of therapy sessions or grand epiphanies. Sometimes it looks like hands in the dirt, like laughter over burned cornbread, like stories told while brushing pollen off your knees. I started to learn things I never thought I would care about: soil acidity, the difference between annuals and perennials, how to deadhead lilies so they'd last longer. Eleanor taught without ever making it feel like a lesson. She'd point out the way sunlight hit the daisies in the late afternoon and tell me, with that spark in her eye, that flowers listened better when you whispered to them. I humored her at first, but then I found myself doing it, talking softly. As I watered the lavender or pruned the overgrown clematis, maybe it was foolish. Or maybe it was the kind of foolishness we all need a little more of. The kind that brings us closer to something bigger than ourselves, even if we can't name what it is. And in that quiet closeness, something else began to grow. Not a crush, not an infatuation, but a kind of deep recognition. As if I had finally walked into the room where the rest of me had been waiting. Eleanor didn't try to impress or perform. She simply existed, fully and unapologetically. And in her presence, I felt free to do the same. There were no games, no expectations, just the soft unfolding of two people sharing a space neither of us knew we needed until it was already ours. One late July evening, we sat on the porch watching the lightning bugs emerge in slow motion against the darkening sky. The air was thick and still, the kind of heat that made conversations slow and thoughtful. She handed me a glass of iced tea, her fingers brushing mine for the briefest second, and something unspoken passed between us. Not desire exactly, but a warmth, an understanding. We didn't need to name it. It was enough to feel it. I asked her once if she ever thought about leaving this town, this house. She smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling in that way I'd come to find endlessly comforting. Why would I? Everything I've ever loved has either been here or found its way here eventually. I didn't know if that last part was meant for me, but I felt it settle into my chest all the same. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A few days later, I brought over a bench I had refinished in my garage. Nothing fancy. Just an old piece of oak I'd found at a yard sale and sanded down until the grain came back to life. I placed it under the peach tree in the far corner of her yard, where the morning sun hit first. She ran her hand over the worn armrest, tears glimmering but not falling. Gerald always wanted a bench here, she whispered, and then without another word, she sat down, inviting me beside her. We stayed like that for an hour, maybe more, listening to the birds, letting the silence do the talking. In that moment, I realized that love doesn't always announce itself with fireworks or symphonies. Sometimes it shows up as a bench beneath a tree, shared stillness, and the quiet knowledge that you are no longer alone. The days stretched into weeks. By mid-August, I was spending more time in Eleanor's backyard than my own home. We fell into a patterned breakfast on Saturdays, gardening on Sundays, the occasional walk through town when the weather cooperated. She had a favorite cafe where the barista knew her by name and always slipped her an extra biscotti. Introduced me as her favorite neighbor, though there was never any doubt I'd become something more than that. Still, we didn't speak it out loud. Not yet. It was as if naming it too soon might fracture the magic of it all, so we kept dancing around the edge, letting the feeling grow roots before giving it light. There were stories she hadn't told me yet, I could sense. Bits and pieces she was still holding back, maybe to protect herself, maybe to protect me. One evening, while trimming back the hydrangeas, she paused and stared off toward the fence line. "You know," she said slowly, "Gerald and I used to dream about growing old here. But dreams shift, don't they?" She turned to me then, her eyes softer than I'd ever seen them. "I used to think love only came once if you were lucky. But now I'm not so sure." Those words stayed with me long after I left that night. I turned them over in my mind, like stones, smooth and heavy. What did they mean exactly? Was she saying what I thought she was saying? Or was I hearing what I wanted to hear? I didn't sleep much that night. Instead, I sat on my own porch, staring at the empty space across the street, wondering how a simple request to water some flowers had led me to this place of quiet, complicated hope. The next morning, I found a note tucked into one of the garden gloves I kept in her shed. In Eleanor's looping, elegant handwriting, it read, "Thank you for watering more than my garden. E." No explanation, no elaboration, but I didn't need one. I folded it carefully and placed it in my wallet, where it would stay, just in case I ever needed to remind myself that sometimes love writes itself in the margins of our lives before we even realize we're reading a new chapter. By the time August melted into the first cool hints of September, the rhythm we had found began to feel like something sacred, as though each moment we spent together was another petal unfolding on some shared flower neither of us had planned to plant. I started waking up before the sun, sipping coffee with the anticipation of walking across the quiet street to her garden. There was something in the morning light that made Eleanor's home shimmer with a kind of nostalgia I couldn't explain, like I had already lived some of these moments in another life and was only now returning to them. Every visit held a softness. Every glance between us contained more silence than words, but a silence that felt full, not empty. That fullness followed me throughout the day. It followed me even when I wasn't with her, and it started to change things inside me. Eleanor wasn't just a woman who had lost her husband and learned to keep growing anyway. She was someone who held the past with tenderness, but didn't let it imprison her. She talked about Gerald sometimes, not in mourning, but in reverence. She shared stories of their early years together, the time they drove across the Midwest in a camper with nothing but a paper map and a shared dream. The Christmas they made gingerbread houses so elaborate the neighbors came just to see them. In the final spring before his diagnosis, when he planted a new bed of tulips just to surprise her, I listened without jealousy because I understood that she wasn't comparing. She was offering me the truth of her heart, letting me see where I might fit within it. There was a day in early September when we decided, without ever saying so, to begin a small project together, expanding the garden. There was an unused patch along the east side of the fence, overgrown with ivy and shaded for most of the day. "A little too dark for roses," she said, crouching beside me as we cleared the roots, but perfect for ferns and shade lilies. We spent an entire afternoon digging, trimming, pulling, and by the end, we were covered in sweat and soil, laughing like two teenagers who had discovered a secret world in the backyard. We sat afterward on the porch with cold lemon water and shared a silence that was more intimate than any conversation. I looked at her, really looked at her, with the garden dirt smudged on her cheek and the wind tugging gently at the corners of her cardigan, and I realized I didn't want this to be temporary. I didn't want to return to my old life, or to the version of myself that didn't know her, didn't have this space, this shared peace. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant hum of crickets, and thought about what it would mean to stay. Not just in the neighborhood, not just as the man who watered her garden, but as someone who belonged. But doubt crept in too. I wondered what it looked like from the outside, me in my 40s, still fumbling with the aftermath of a collapsed marriage, finding solace in a woman a decade or so my senior, a woman who had already lived a whole life of love and loss. Was I projecting something onto her, or was this real? The next morning, I brought over a tray of muffins I had picked up from the Sunday farmer's market. Eleanor was sitting in the garden already, pruning the lavender, her wide-brimmed hat casting a soft shadow over her face. She looked up and smiled when she saw me, and something inside me steadied. I sat beside her, placed the tray between us, and told her I had been thinking about that new patch of garden, how maybe we could build a little archway with climbing ivy or hang wind chimes from the elder tree nearby. She listened quietly, nodded, and then said something that caught me completely off guard. "You know," she said gently, "every morning I look out my window and hope you'll be here again. Not just for the garden, but for me." Her words didn't hit like thunder or fireworks. It landed like soft rain on dry earth, expected, needed healing. I looked at her, heart beating in my throat, and in that moment I understood that we had been building something all along. It's not a romance born from fantasy or desperation, but a connection forged through repetition, care, and quiet understanding. It was deeper than affection. It was acknowledgement. I reached for her hand, still gloved from gardening, and simply held it. After that, things didn't change dramatically. There were no declarations, no sudden shifts. We still spent our days tending the garden, fixing broken gate latches, and sharing stories over tea. But there was a new ease between us, an unspoken yes that had been waiting patiently beneath all our moments. I found myself staying later into the evenings, helping her close up the garden tools, walking slowly back across the street only after the stars had claimed the sky. She never asked for more, and neither did I. But the possibility hung between us like the perfume of blooming jasmine, subtle, persistent, impossible to ignore. I began to see her house not as someone else's home, but as a place where my presence meant something. I started bringing over my books, leaving my gardening gloves in her shed without thinking, offering to cook dinner some nights. Not because I wanted to impress her, but because I wanted to feed her, care for her the way she had been caring for me all this time. We joked about installing a secret gate between our backyards, how it would save me the walk across the street. And even though we never built it, the joke itself became another thread in the growing tapestry of us. That fall, a sudden frost rolled. And earlier than expected, we lost a few delicate flowers overnight, and Eleanor mourned them like old friends. I watched her that morning, moving slowly among the beds, covering what she could, salvaging what remained, and I realized how strong she really was. Not in a performative way, but in the quiet, enduring way that some people carry their grief. Like a well-worn coat, heavy, familiar, but no longer unbearable. That's when I knew that this wasn't just about a garden, or even about us. This was about how life continues to grow, even when we think the soil is spent. About how we all bloom again when given the right light, right hands, the right time. And when she turned to me that morning, cheeks flushed from the cold, and said softly, "You've made this place feel alive again," I smiled and answered, "Honestly, so have you." Autumn settled in like an old friend returning home after a long time away, familiar and comforting, but slightly changed. The trees along our little street turned fiery with color gold. Crimson, deep copper, and Eleanor's garden began its slow retreat into the earth, preparing for rest. She approached this shift with a kind of quiet reverence. But she didn't fight the fading, didn't mourn the loss of the blooms. Instead, she embraced the ritual of pruning and mulching, of tucking things in for winter. I watched her crouch beside the beds in her faded flannel coat, placing leaves around the roots of her hydrangeas, like a blanket. And I thought to myself that there was a lesson in this. She didn't cling to the flowers that were gone. She made space for them to return. That's when I realized how much of Eleanor's life had been shaped by acceptance, not passivity. But the kind of grace that comes from knowing how to stay open while letting go. We spent more time inside the house. As the days grew colder, Eleanor's home had a warmth that wasn't just from the fireplace or the cinnamon tea. She steeped in her favorite chipped kettle. It was the kind of warmth that made you want to sit a little longer, speak a little softer, listen a little more. The walls were lined with memories, photographs of family, small oil paintings of local hills and rivers, faded recipe cards in her kitchen that had clearly been touched by generations. I found myself drawn to those quiet corners of her life, to the worn quilt on the back of her couch that still carried the scent of lavender, to the wooden clock in the hallway that chimed on the hour, its sound deep and old and comforting. This wasn't a house you passed through. It was a house that held you one night. After we'd finished a dinner of roasted squash and lentil soup, she pulled out a photo album I hadn't seen before. It was smaller than the others, bound in worn leather, and the pages inside had begun to curl slightly with time. "This one," she said, "was just for me." The photos weren't of family gatherings or holidays. They were snapshots of everyday things, sunsets from her porch, flowers at their peak, a cup of tea on a rainy day, Gerald napping in a chair with a book in his lap. She showed them to me without commentary, turning the pages slowly, letting the images speak for themselves. I felt honored somehow that she trusted me with them, that she wanted me to see the parts of her life that no one else had ever really noticed. There were evenings where we didn't speak at all, just listened to music on her old record player, or read quietly beside one another, our knees brushing, occasionally beneath the blanket we shared. These were not dramatic moments, not the kind you read about in novels, but they felt profound in their simplicity. I had spent so much of my adult life chasing meaning in loud places and careers, in complicated relationships, in relentless striving. But here, beside Eleanor, I found meaning in the stillness. I found it in the rhythm of her breath, in the way she looked at me when I wasn't speaking, in the soft scrape of her spoon against a bowl of soup. One afternoon in early November, I arrived to find her in the backyard, staring up at the elder tree. Most of its leaves had fallen, and its gnarled branches reached skyward like something ancient and wise. "I think it's time," she said, without turning around. At first I didn't know what she meant. But then she led me back inside, and into a small room I hadn't entered before, what she called the spare room, though it had clearly been more than that once. Inside was a large cedar chest at the foot of the bed. She knelt beside it, ran her fingers along the lid, and opened it. Inside were letters, dozens of them, some in envelopes, some just folded sheets. "Gerald's," she said softly. "Some to me, some from me, some we never sent." She looked up at me then, her eyes clear. "I kept them because I needed to, but I think I need to let them go now." We spent the next few hours reading a few aloud, laughing at the wit in Gerald's words, crying quietly when the lines became harder to read. Then she handed me a small stack. "Would you help me burn them?" We went to the fire pit in the backyard, the garden around us silent and bare, the sky low with winter clouds.
Ow.
One by one we placed the letters into the flames, watching as the paper curled and vanished. I didn't ask her why she chose now. I didn't need to. Sometimes the heart knows when it's time to make room for something new. After the last letter turned to ash, she reached for my hand. It wasn't a romantic gesture, not really. It was something deeper, a gesture of trust, of shared memory, of release. That night, as we sat beside the fire, the smoke rising into the cold air, I felt something shift between us again. We were no longer to people sharing time. We were to people carrying time together. I began to sleep at Eleanor's more often. It's not because we were suddenly lovers, but because the lines between our lives had blurred into something indistinguishable. I kept clothes in her dresser. She made space on the bookshelf for my novels. We still didn't talk about what it meant. We didn't need to. The truth was in the way we moved through space like two notes in the same melody. I'd wake in the morning to the smell of coffee and the sound of her humming in the kitchen. She'd bring me a mug without asking how I took it, because by now she already knew. We started preparing the garden for next spring, not because we knew we'd still be doing this then, but because we hoped. And hope, I was learning, was a kind of planting too. The first snow arrived quietly, as if it had tiptoed its way down from the clouds while we weren't looking. Eleanor was the one who noticed it first. I'd just come in from the shed with a bundle of firewood, stomping my boots on the mat when I saw her standing by the window. Her shoulders were slightly hunched, hands wrapped around a steaming mug, and her gaze was fixed outward with a kind of wonder usually reserved for children. Outside, delicate flakes drifted down like tiny feathers, coating the garden beds and covering the last few stubborn leaves clinging to the branches. It was one of those moments where time seemed to slow. It's not because anything grand was happening, but because everything suddenly felt heavier with meaning. I walked up beside her without speaking. Together we watched the world soften beneath the snow. That evening the house felt smaller in a good way. The windows steamed from the warmth inside, and every creak of the floorboards beneath our feet felt like a familiar voice. Eleanor had lit candles, something she always did on nights when the weather turned. And the flickering light gave. The garden outside was nearly invisible now, buried beneath a thin white layer that erased the hard lines of beds and stones and tools, but I knew it was still there. Every seed, every bulb, every carefully tended root sleeping, yes, but alive. And that thought comforted me. It reminded me of something I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the way people carry love after loss. Maybe it was just what it meant to wait for spring. Over the following weeks, our routine changed again. The garden in hibernation, our attention turned inward. We sorted old books, fixed squeaky hinges, made soups from scratch. Sometimes we'd spend an entire afternoon just reorganizing the attic or untangling boxes of Christmas lights. These weren't chores. They were rituals. They were acts of preservation, of care. And through them, I began to see just how deeply Eleanor had carved a life out of solitude, how she had tended not only to her garden, but to herself in all the quiet years since Gerald had passed. She had built a kind of peace within these walls, soft resilience that didn't shout or demand attention but simply existed, steady and true. One morning, just after the holidays, I brought over an old photo of my parents I had recently found. While going through storage, it was worn, edges curled, the colors fading, but the image was clear. My father with his arm around my mother, both of them laughing at something just out of frame. I hadn't thought about them in years. Died within months of each other, when I was still in my 20s. And somewhere along the line, their memory had become more abstract than real. But something about being with Eleanor had stirred those old feelings. The way she moved through the world, the way she loved, reminded me of them not because of any specific resemblance, but because of the same kind of steadiness, the way she made things feel safe and known. Eleanor took the photo gently, studying it like a curator in a museum. Then, without asking, she placed it in a small frame and set it on the mantel, right beside a picture of her and Gerald. It wasn't a grand gesture, but to me it meant everything. It was her way of saying, your past matters here, you matter. Here, and for the first time in a long time, felt like I was standing on solid ground. January passed in a blur of snow and warm drinks and books read by firelight. We began playing board games in the evenings. Old ones Eleanor had kept from years ago, their corners frayed, pieces slightly worn. We'd argue playfully over the rules, laugh when one of us inevitably cheated a little, and sometimes pause in the middle of a game just to talk. That was the thing about us, conversation could bloom anywhere, in the middle of a recipe, during a commercial, while folding laundry. Our words had become another kind of garden, something we tended together, something that grew without needing much effort as winter stretched on. I found myself thinking about the future in ways I hadn't in years. Not in terms of grand plans or resolutions, but in smaller, more tender ways, like what we'd plant come spring. Whether we'd repaint the kitchen cabinets, whether I'd move in officially, or just keep leaving a little more of myself behind. Each day, it wasn't a fear that held me back. It was the knowledge that what we had was delicate, not fragile, but precious. And I didn't want to rush it, didn't want to force something before it was ready to bloom. Then one Sunday morning, everything shifted. I had gone out to shovel her walkway after another overnight snow, and when I came back in, she was sitting at the table with a notebook open in front of her. She didn't look up at first, kept writing, her pen moving steadily across the page. When she finally did look at me, her expression was unreadable, calm, but with something else behind it. She slid the notebook toward me without saying a word. I hesitated, then sat down and began to read. It wasn't a letter, not exactly, more like a reflection. A long stream of thought she'd poured onto the page about her life, about Gerald, about me, about how, for the first time since he'd passed, she had stopped feeling alone, about how I had brought color back into her days, about how she wasn't looking for romance or rescue, but she also wasn't afraid of what we were becoming. She ended it with a line that stopped my breath. I don't need you to promise me forever, but if you ever feel ready, you have permission to stay. I looked up and saw her watching me, her eyes soft but steady. I didn't know what to say. I didn't need to. I reached across the table, took her hand and held it in both of mine. In that moment, I understood something I had never understood before. Love doesn't always arrive in thunderclaps or grand declarations. Sometimes it shows up slowly, gently, like water finding its way through the cracks. Sometimes it waits until you're quiet enough to hear it. When it does, it feels like home. The days that followed moved slowly, not with hesitation, but with a calm certainty like water winding through familiar terrain. There was a new rhythm between us, one shaped by unspoken understanding rather than overt declarations. The notebook Eleanor had shared with me remained on her kitchen counter, open to the page where her final sentence had lingered like a leaf. Resting in still water, I didn't touch it again, and she didn't ask. It was not a conversation we needed to revisit, because its weight was not in the words alone, but in everything that had followed. There was no tension in the air, no anxious wondering. Instead, there was presence. We both continued our routines: coffee in the morning, a walk to the mailbox when the snow allowed, evenings by the fire, but something had shifted beneath. Those routines, like roots deepening under frost-hardened soil. I noticed the small ways we began to move in tandem without trying, like reaching for the same pot in the cupboard or pausing the radio at the same time when a song we both loved came on. There was a shared rhythm to our silences now, a quiet agreement that this, whatever it was, didn't need defining to be real. Winter, in its depth, is a test of patience. It asks you to endure the monotony of gray skies, to find beauty in starkness, to trust that the soil beneath your feet still holds promise even when everything above it seems lifeless. And in a strange way, Eleanor and I had become experts at this kind of endurance. We didn't seek out grand projects or create artificial distractions to fill the days. Instead, we settled into the details, the smell of soup simmering on the stove, the satisfaction of folding laundry still warm from the dryer, feel of her hand brushing against mine as we both reached for the same piece of kindling. Were not gestures of passion, but of partnership, of rootedness. I began to realize that this kind of connection, this kind of love, if I dared to call it, that was less about intensity and more about continuity. It was not the firework, it was the ember that kept burning. I started spending entire weekends at her house without even thinking about it. My own place, a small apartment just 10 minutes down the road, began to feel more like a storage unit than a home. The plants there were wilting from neglect, and the fridge was mostly empty, except for condiments and expired yogurt. It wasn't that I had consciously moved in with Eleanor. It was that I had gradually stopped leaving. One night, as I brushed my teeth using the toothbrush I now kept in her medicine cabinet, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror and was struck by how calm I looked. Not happy in the bubbly, outward-facing sense, but peaceful in a way I hadn't seen in years. I had spent most of my adult life chasing versions of happiness defined by others' career milestones. Romantic fireworks, social validation. Now here I was, finding it in the way she folded a dish towel or adjusted the thermostat to make sure I was comfortable. Still, there were questions that hung in the air between us, not because they hadn't been answered, but because neither of us had asked them. We hadn't talked about what we were, or what we were becoming. There had been no labels exchanged, no conversations about the future in the way couples usually have them. And yet, every time she handed me a mug of tea without asking how I wanted it, or when I brought in firewood without her reminding me, it felt like those questions had already been answered in a language older than words. We were building something not through declarations, but through presence, through attention, through the way we showed up for one another, day after day. It was on a Wednesday, during a late February thaw, that something unexpected happened. The snow had melted enough to reveal the muddy outline of the garden beds beneath, and Eleanor had gone out to check on the soil, her boots squelching with each step. I stayed inside, watching her from the window, amused by the way she crouched to press her palm to the dirt, as if listening for a heartbeat. She stayed out there longer than usual, and when she finally came back in, she had a strange look on her face, part excitement, part uncertainty. She held something in her hand, cupped carefully like a secret. It was the first sprout of the season, a single green shoot that had broken through the soil early, perhaps confused by the warm spell. She placed it on the kitchen counter gently, then looked at me and said, "It's time to start planning." I knew she wasn't just talking about the garden, so we sat down at the table and began to map out the spring beds. What to plant, where, what to move, what to try for the first time. It felt like something more than just a hobby. It felt like a metaphor made flesh. Planting a garden requires trust not just in the soil or the weather, but in time itself. You plant something today because you believe in tomorrow. Because you believe that with care, it will grow. And as we sketched out rows of herbs and flowers and vegetables, I realized that this was how Eleanor had always lived. Not with certainty, but with faith in the process. With hope stitched quietly into every action. Later that evening, as I brought up an extra blanket from the closet and tucked it over her knees where she sat reading, she looked up at me with a softness that was almost too much to bear. "You take care of things," she said, her voice low. "Not just plants or tasks, people, me." I didn't know how to respond, so I just knelt beside her and rested my head on her lap. Her fingers threaded gently through my hair, and for a long time, we stayed that way, not needing to speak. The truth was, I had never imagined a love like this, slow, quiet, unassuming, but I had also never felt safer, never felt more seen. And as I drifted into sleep later that night, listening to the wind rattle softly against the window panes and the steady rhythm of her breathing beside me, I knew that whatever we were building, it was real, it was lasting. It didn't need to be named to be known, like a seed beneath the soil. It was already becoming. The weather shifted again in the days that followed, swinging between thaw and frost like a pendulum, uncertain of which season to commit to. Eleanor, unfazed by the volatility, began her ritual of preparing seed trays in the sunroom. It had become something of a sacred space, windows fogged with condensation. Small wooden shelves lined with terracotta pots and labeled plastic trays. A radio softly playing instrumental music that drifted like a heartbeat through the house. She moved with focus and grace, her fingers nimble as they dropped tiny seeds into pre-moistened soil, covering them with a careful pat, as if tucking them in for sleep. I watched her from the doorway, a mug of tea cooling in my hand, struck again by the gentle patience that defined her. There was no urgency to her movements, only intention, as if she understood time not as a resource to be spent, but as a companion to be respected. It was in those quiet hours, surrounded by the scent of damp earth and the clink of gardening tools, that I began to understand just how much her life was rooted in cycles. Not just seasonal ones, but emotional ones too. Growth, retreat, blooming, dormancy. She never forced things. Even our connection, now woven so subtly into the fabric of our days, had not been demanded or defined, like it had simply unfolded, like petals in sunlight, slow and steady. There was no performance between us, no need to impress or seduce, and yet in that absence of trying, something deeper had emerged. A trust not built on dramatic moments, but on shared routines and silent acknowledgments. One morning, I awoke to the sound of her humming in the kitchen, a soft melody that echoed through the floorboards like a lullaby. The smell of toasted bread and eggs reached me before I even sat up, and when I came down the stairs, still blinking away sleep, she greeted me with a smile that felt like home. We ate at the table without speaking much, just passing each other condiments and taking turns refilling coffee. Outside, frost glittered on the grass, catching the morning light in a way that made the entire yard look like a field of stars. After breakfast, we bundled ourselves in layers and walked the perimeter of the property, surveying branches broken by wind, patches of soil that might need turning, areas where the snowmelt had created rivulets that traced new patterns across the garden beds. We didn't talk about anything profound, but the silence between our words was full of understanding, of affection, a mutual care that no longer required affirmation. That afternoon, as I replaced a loose board on the porch railing, Eleanor sat on the steps behind me with a notebook in her lap, occasionally reading aloud snippets from old gardening books or poems she had copied down over the years. She didn't expect responses. It wasn't a performance. It was more like she was letting the words breathe in the air between us, offering them up like petals in the wind. And I found myself remembering things I hadn't thought of in years, how my mother used to hum when she folded laundry, how my father once taught me the right way to split firewood, how I had always longed for a sense of permanence, even as I wandered from one job to another, one city to the next. In Eleanor's presence, I felt like I had finally stopped running, even if I hadn't realized I'd been fleeing in the first place. As the weeks passed, small changes began to settle in with more permanence. I brought over a few of my books and tucked them onto her shelf next to hers. My spare pair of boots took up residence by her door, and she never asked when I planned to take them back. We started making weekly grocery lists together, arguing in the lightest way over which brand of coffee was better, whose turn it was to cook, whether her tomato seeds really needed to be started this early. These arguments weren't really arguments at all. They were threads in a tapestry we didn't even know we were weaving. And I started to wonder if this was what real love looked like, not fireworks or passionate declarations, but knowing someone so well that their habits became part of your own rhythm. Still, there was a quiet part of me that resisted putting a name to what we were building. Perhaps it was fear that labeling it would pin it down, make it something brittle and breakable. Or maybe it was reverence, a deep respect for the mystery of what we had created. Every time I looked at her, not just when she was laughing or speaking, but when she was completely still, I felt the weight of that mystery. I didn't want to disturb it. I wanted to live in it. But even mysteries, I was beginning to understand, had seasons. And seasons inevitably lead to change. It happened on a Sunday evening, so we sat together on the couch, a documentary playing softly in the background. Her hand rested lightly on mine, and I noticed for the first time how frail it had become. The bones beneath the skin more visible now, the veins like thin rivers. She had always seemed ageless to me, timeless in the way old trees are timeless, rooted in something deeper than chronology. But in that moment, I was reminded of the impermanence of even the most enduring things. I tightened my fingers around hers without saying anything, and she looked at me not surprised, not alarmed, but with a softness that told me she had noticed the same thing long before I had. We didn't speak of it then, but in the days that followed, I began to pay more attention. The way she sometimes paused on the stairs, catching her breath, the way she leaned a little heavier on the table when she stood. None of it alarming on its own, but together, it formed a pattern, a subtle decline like the last light of day. Slipping behind the horizon, I didn't ask questions, and she didn't offer answers. Instead, we both became gentler, more deliberate in our movements, as if acknowledging that we had entered a new phase of our shared story, one that required even more care or presence. And perhaps that was the point all along, not to fight the seasons, but to meet them, to walk alongside them, hand in hand, no matter how short or long the path ahead. There was no need to rush, no need to define, it's only to remain, rooted, attentive, and open. The following week unfolded like a quiet confession, full of unsaid things spoken through gestures and long silences that no longer felt empty. There was a gravity to our time now, a kind of hush over everything we did, so both of us understood that we were walking gently through a threshold neither of us wanted to acknowledge too loudly. I continued to come every morning, still carrying the old metal watering can, as if that first act. Me showing up for the garden was the sacred thread that bound all this together, and maybe it was, maybe it always had been. That simple kindness, repeated over and over until it became something bigger than either of us intended. Eleanor began greeting me on the porch more often than not, wrapped in one of her oversized shawls. Sometimes with a book in her hand or a biscuit she had saved. For me, and we'd sit for a few minutes before even speaking. Our eyes watched the horizon more these days. She seemed to be listening for something the rest of us couldn't hear, something just past the edge of morning. Our conversations changed subtly, like the shift in wind before a storm, where once we'd talked about practicalities, the soil, the forecast, errands to run. We now drifted into stories from her youth, little memories she seemed to be offering me like heirlooms. She told me about a time she snuck onto a train with her sister to visit the coast when they were teenagers, and how they got caught in a rainstorm and ended up walking barefoot down a gravel road, laughing so hard they forgot how much it hurt. She talked about her first love, a boy with wild curls and too much bravado who wrote her a song on a napkin. She talked about loss too, about her brother who never came back from his last deployment, and the silence that settled over her family. Like a second grief, I listened, absorbing it all, feeling each detail nestled itself into the story I now carried of her. Oh, the way she had gradually become the central figure in my daily thoughts. I realized something then. In those slow hours by her side, I wasn't just falling in love with Eleanor as she was now, but with every version of her she had ever been. The fearless teenager, the grieving sister, the heartbroken young woman, the solitary gardener. They all lived in her still, layered like rings in an ancient tree. And by learning them, I was learning how to love her more honestly, not just for what she offered me now, but for everything she had weathered before I ever came along. The garden, once a place for flowers and vegetables, had become something of a living metaphor for us. We walked among the rows she had planted, and I saw her legacy in every bloom. The earth bore her imprint, her tenderness. Even the weeds seemed reluctant to rise too aggressively, as though they too respected her quiet dominion. Then came the Thursday she didn't open the door. It was unusual. It's not alarming at first, but enough to make me pause. Her shawl was folded neatly on the bench outside, her boots aligned beneath it. I knocked gently and waited. Nothing. I tried the bell, heard its faint chime echo through the house like a question no one was willing to answer. After a few minutes, I let myself in, calling her name as I moved through the rooms that had become familiar. I found her sitting in her sunroom, not collapsed or in danger, but quiet, her hands folded on her lap, eyes closed. She opened them. As I approached, smiled faintly, and gestured for me to sit. There was no panic, no rush, just an overwhelming stillness that held everything in place. She told me, in her way, that things were changing inside her. Not a diagnosis, at least not yet, but an awareness. A fatigue that didn't lift with rest, a fog that came and went, confusion in the middle of small tasks she had done without thinking for years. She hadn't told anyone else. I was the first, perhaps the only. And I understood then why the days had begun to feel heavier, not just because of the weight of winter's end, but because she had been carrying this knowledge alone, unsure how or when to say it aloud. I didn't respond with platitudes. Didn't tell her to fight or to hope. Instead, I reached for her hand and sat with her, offering the only thing I knew how to give: presence. Not a solution, but a kind of witness. She leaned her head on my shoulder, and we stayed that way until the light outside changed, till the sun shifted low enough that it painted the walls gold. The next few days took on a different rhythm. We moved slower. She let me help more. Began cooking dinner most nights, adjusting her favorite recipes to match the notes she'd left scribbled in the margins of her cookbooks. I took over the watering entirely. I kept the fire going in the evenings and read aloud from the books she used to recite from memory. The closeness between us grew more tender, less unspoken now. We said things plainly about what we appreciated, about what we feared, about what had surprised us most about this unexpected chapter we'd found ourselves writing together. There were tears sometimes, but they never felt heavy. They were soft things, like rain that soaked into the earth without flooding it. We held space for each other. That was all. That was enough. One morning I arrived to find her in the backyard, staring up at the trellis covered in dormant vines. She turned to me, smiled, and said it was almost time to trim them back. Pruning, she said, was about trust, about believing in return, about knowing that cutting something didn't kill it, Tip just prepared it for more growth. I stood there, with her, the shears in my hand, and together we made our way through the brittle tangles, cutting gently, clearing the way for whatever would come next. It struck me then that love, the real kind, isn't about the crescendo. It isn't about the grand gestures or the declarations. It's about this, about showing up again and again, about pruning when needed, about watering through the droughts. It's about being there when the blooms return. And somewhere in that quiet work, I began to see the future, not in years, but in seasons. Not in guarantees, but in presence. The days ahead might bring decline. They might bring heartbreak. But they would also bring meaning. They would bring the kind of love that holds fast even as everything else fades. And that, I realized, was enough to stay for. That was enough to believe in. Spring came in quietly that year, not with the bluster of wind and downpours, but with a gentle unfolding, the way a letter opens in trembling hands. Eleanor's garden, long dormant and bare, began to stir with the first signs of life buds swelling on vines we'd once cut back together, soil turning soft and pliable under my boots. I showed up every morning, same as before, but there was a deeper meaning to the routine now, a reverence that had crept into each act. I brought with me not just water and tools, but a steady presence she had come to rely on, and maybe even lean into. We no longer questioned why I stayed so long, or why her porch had become a second home to me. The time we spent together was never discussed in terms of necessity or intention. It simply was. The way the sun showed up, or the wind came through the trees. Her days were not always easy anymore. There were moments of lucidity and light, and her laughter came quickly, and her stories trailed off, only because there were too many to choose from. And then there were days when she stared through me as though searching for a thread she couldn't quite hold. It broke my heart in ways I hadn't prepared for. Watching her reach for words that used to come so easily or pause in the middle of a sentence. It's as though it had slipped out the back door while she wasn't looking. But she bore it all with grace. And I, in turn, bore witness with quiet devotion. One afternoon, sat side by side in her sunroom, the light catching dust motes that danced slowly in the air between us. She had pulled out a box of old letters and photographs, some yellowed at the corners, others still sharp and vivid. Her fingers brushed over them as though greeting old friends, and she began telling me the stories behind each one. There was a photo of her standing next to a lemon tree, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and smiling like someone who had just discovered joy for the first time. That, she said, was taken in Sicily, where she spent a summer teaching English to a group of children who swore she was a movie star. Another was of a man I hadn't seen before, dark-haired eyes, serious even in the grainy image. She paused there for a long time, her thumb tracing the edge of his face. That was Daniel, she said finally, and the name hung in the air like a memory. We weren't meant to last, but oh, we burned bright for a while. She looked at me, something fragile flickering in her eyes. I haven't thought about him in years, not really. Funny how things return when you begin to let go. I didn't pry. I didn't ask the obvious questions. Instead, I listened as she unfolded bits of herself, as if placing pieces of a map in my hands, trusting I would know where to look. Over the weeks that followed, she began giving me more than just stories. She handed me a worn copy of her favorite poetry collection, its margins scribbled with thoughts in a looping script.
Ow.
She gave me the keys to the shed and instructions on how to mix her compost, written in blue ink on the back of a gardening catalog. And one day, without ceremony, she handed me the deed to the garden plot she had been renting for decades from the county, a quiet gift wrapped in the assumption that someone should keep growing things here even when she no longer could. Just promise me, she said, her voice soft as the soil, that you'll plant something new every spring, even if it's just one thing. I promised, though I could barely get the words out. And in that moment, I understood something. Deeper about the love we had built, it was not rooted in possession, or even in a future we could name. It was built in trust and continuity. In the belief that one life could gently carry forward another, the bond between us had outgrown the confines of definition. It was no longer romantic in the way people often think of love, nor was it platonic. In the absence of depth, it was simply real, expansive, encompassing. I cooked her meals that reminded her of places she'd been. She left notes in my truck with poems she thought I'd like. I rubbed balm into her hands when they ached, and she insisted on brushing lint off my shirt before I left, like I was heading off to war instead of just home. There was something sacred in our care for each other, a tenderness that lived in the mundane. And yet, there were still moments that startled me with their intimacy, the kind that made me catch my breath. Like the night we watched a storm roll, in thunder shaking the panes, and she reached for my hand not out of fear, but because it anchored her, or the time she told me that when I laughed. It reminded her of a creek she used to sit beside as a child, the sound of water over stone. "It calms the air," she said. I think I fell a little more in love with her than not with her face or her past, but with the way she saw me. Not as a savior or caretaker, but as someone worth knowing fully. Then came the evening when she looked at me across the garden, her face lit by the last golden light of the day, and said, almost absently, if I believed in reincarnation, I'd asked to come back as a flower in your garden, just so you'd keep watering me. I smiled, unsure of what to say. But she continued, voice steady, "You already do, you know. Even now, every day you show up, you water my heart." And I knew then that everything we had grown, every glance, every shared silence, every gentle gesture had led to this moment. Not a declaration of love in the way movies would frame it, but something far more enduring, a recognition, a knowing. We had become each other's home in a world that often forgot how to stay. That night, I walked back through the garden slowly, my hand brushing the tops of the new shoots. I thought of how love, like gardening, was about constancy. Not every seed sprouted, not every bloom lasted. But the act itself, the showing up, the tending, the belief in what might come next, that was what made it sacred. That was what made it enough. And in loving Eleanor the way I did, in being loved by her in return, I had found something most people spend a lifetime chasing. Not just a partner or a purpose, but peace. Quiet, unwavering peace. The days rolled on, each one a soft echo of the last, filled with rhythms both familiar and new. Eleanor's garden flourished beneath my care, and with it grew the quiet companionship that had become the heart of our lives. We spent mornings wandering among the rows of budding plants, our conversations weaving in and out like the vines climbing the trellis. There were moments when her eyes would light up with stories from her youth, and other times when silence held us in a warm embrace, the unspoken words filling the space between us with comfort rather than loneliness. The world beyond her garden gate seemed to shrink, and in its place, a small universe of trust and tenderness took shape. I learned to read the subtle shifts in her mood, to offer a hand when she needed steadiness, to step back when she sought space. Our connection wasn't defined by grand gestures, but by countless tiny acts of care. The way she would leave a cup of tea waiting for me, how I'd sweep the porch to keep it tidy. How we shared quiet smiles that said everything without a single word. It was as if we had discovered a secret language, spoken not through voice, but through presence. One afternoon, as the sun poured golden light over the petals of the newly blooming roses, Eleanor invited me inside for tea. The kitchen was warm and fragrant with the scent of baked bread and herbs, a refuge from the chilly breeze outside. As I sat across from her, I noticed the way her hands trembled slightly as she poured the tea. And for the first time, I saw Lele, vulnerability that had been hidden beneath her usual grace. She told me about the dreams that had started to visit her at night, dreams of places she had never been and faces she didn't recognize. They were both beautiful and unsettling, like memories from another lifetime trying to break through the fog. I listened without interruption, offering the kind of quiet support that spoke louder than any advice. It struck me then how fragile and precious our time together truly was, and how deeply I had come to care for this woman, who was both strong and delicate. fierce and tender. The garden had become a sanctuary not just for plants, but for our spirits. Each season brought new challenges and triumphs: the stubborn weeds that threatened to overtake the flower beds, the unexpected rain that drenched the soil, the quiet miracle of a seedling pushing through the earth toward the sun. In many ways, the garden mirrored our journey, messy at times, uncertain but always alive with hope. Eleanor took to writing again, her words flowing like water after a long drought. She shared with me her poems and short stories, fragments of her soul laid bare on the page. I marveled at her ability to capture the beauty in ordinary moments. Way light filtered through leaves, the scent of rain on dry earth, the sound of a child's laughter carried on the wind. Her writing was a gift she gave not only to herself, but to the world, a reminder that even in the midst of loss and change, there was still so much to celebrate. As spring turned to summer, we found ourselves drawn closer in ways that neither of us had anticipated. It was a quiet intimacy in the way our hands brushed while planting new seedlings, a softness in the way our eyes met over shared stories. Yet, even as the warmth of the season deepened, so did our understanding that what we had was something beyond labels or expectations. It was a bond forged in honesty and acceptance, one that didn't demand possession or permanence, but instead thrived in the freedom to simply be. We talked openly about the future, acknowledging the uncertainties that lay ahead without fear or regret. Eleanor spoke of her wish to travel again someday, to see the places she'd only dreamed of in her youth. I promised to be there, whether as companion or cheerleader, wherever the road might lead. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in hues of pink and lavender, Eleanor surprised me with a small gift-oppressed flower encased in a delicate glass pendant. "For when you need a reminder," she said softly, "that this garden, this moment, and all of its hours, no matter where life takes us." I felt a lump rise in my throat, overwhelmed by the simple beauty of her gesture. It was a symbol of everything we had nurtured together: trust, kindness, and a love that defied easy definitions. I slipped the pendant over my head and held her hand, knowing that some connections transcend time and circumstance. That night, we sat beneath the stars, the garden alive with the hum of crickets and the soft rustle of leaves, the quiet. I felt a profound gratitude for the journey we had shared, for the way we had watered each other's hearts through every season. Yet, even as our bond grew stronger, life's impermanence whispered in the background. Eleanor's health began to waver, subtle at first, a missed appointment, a tiredness that lingered longer than before. We faced these changes with the same openness and courage that had defined our friendship from the start. I became her steady support, navigating doctor's visits and medication schedules, while she faced the reality of her limitations with dignity and grace. Through it all, the garden remained our constant, a place where hope blossomed amid uncertainty. We spent hours tending to the flowers and vegetables, sharing memories and dreams, finding solace in the simple act of caring for living things. The garden was no longer just a patch of earth. It was a testament to resilience, a symbol of the love that refused to fade even as the days grew shorter. In those quiet moments, I came to understand that love is not always about grand declarations or sweeping gestures. Sometimes it is found in the steady presence of someone who shows up day after day, who waters your heart when it feels dry and fragile. Eleanor and I had grown together in that love, a love that was patient, kind, and enduring, that accepted imperfection and embraced vulnerability, a love that was both refuge and strength. And in that love, we found something rare and precious, a home not built of walls or roofs, but of trust and tenderness, of shared stories and silent understanding. As the summer sun began to wane, I knew that our time together was a gift, one that I would carry with me long after the last flower had bloomed and the garden lay bare for winter. We had watered each other's hearts, nurtured a connection that transcended words and definitions, and in doing so, had found a kind of love that was quiet but unshakable. It was a love that did not ask for possession or permanence, but simply for presence, for the willingness to stand beside another soul through the seasons of life. And for that, I was endlessly grateful. The transition from summer to fall brought with it a gentle shift not only in the garden but in our lives. The once vibrant blossoms began to yield to the soft gold and rust of autumn leaves, and Eleanor's steps grew slower, her breaths a bit more measured. Yet in this changing season, our connection deepened in ways I hadn't expected. There was a profound stillness in the air, a quiet acceptance that seemed to weave itself into every moment we shared. Each morning, I found myself rising early to check on the garden, brushing off the delicate frost that clung to the petals and leaves. The earth was preparing to rest, and so were we, in a way that felt both inevitable and necessary. The urgency of summer's bloom faded, replaced by a reflective calm that invited us to cherish the present without clinging to what was passing. Eleanor often sat on the porch wrapped in a knitted shawl, her eyes scanning the horizon with a softness that was both wistful and serene. Sometimes she would hum an old song or recount a memory from years gone by, her voice carrying the warmth of a lifetime lived with grace and resilience. I listened, feeling privileged to hold space for these fragments of her story, knowing they were gifts she shared with rare openness. As the days shortened and the chill crept into the air, our routine settled into a comforting rhythm. Mornings were for tending to the garden's final tasks, gathering the last of the ripe tomatoes, covering tender plants to shield them from frost, clearing fallen leaves to keep the paths clear. Afternoons were for sitting together with warm drinks, sometimes in companionable silence, other times exchanging stories or plans for the coming holidays. There was an unspoken understanding between us that life was fragile, but so was hope. Even as Eleanor's body showed signs of where her spirit remained remarkably bright, anchored by the love and companionship we had nurtured. I found myself drawn not only to her strength, but to the vulnerability that shone through. In quiet moments when she reached for my hand during a particularly difficult day, or when her eyes glistened with unshed tears as she spoke of things she hoped to leave behind. It was in these moments that I realized our bond was more than friendship. It was a profound form of love that transcended conventional definitions. It was a love rooted in presence. In witnessing one another fully and without judgment, one particularly crisp morning, as a soft fog hung over the garden, Eleanor surprised me by asking to share a story from her childhood, a story she had never told anyone before. We sat on the old wooden bench beneath the maple tree, its leaves a brilliant tapestry of oranges and reds. She spoke of a small town by the sea, where she had grown up running barefoot on sandy shores and chasing waves with carefree abandon. Her voice carried the salt and breeze of that distant place, painting vivid pictures of sunlit days and starry nights. As she spoke, I could see the light in her eyes rekindle, the joy and innocence of youth shining through the years. It was a reminder that beneath the layers of time and experience, the heart remains a wellspring of memories and dreams. Sharing the story felt like a gift, a passing of a torch, an invitation to understand her more deeply. And in turn, I shared my own tales of a childhood spent exploring forests and rivers, of the dreams that had shaped me into the person I was. Through these exchanges, we wove a richer tapestry of connection, one that bridged past and present, weaving our lives together. With threads of shared understanding and compassion, the garden too reflected our evolving journey. As the vibrant blooms of summer faded, the hardy late-season flowers took their place, mums in deep purples and golds, asters sprinkled like stars among the greenery. The vegetable beds gave way to rows of garlic and kale, preparing for the cold months ahead. There was a quiet satisfaction in this cycle, a reassurance that endings were simply beginnings in disguise. I marveled at how the garden, much like our relationship, embraced change without losing its essence. Each seed planted was a promise of life to come, each leaf fallen a lesson in letting go. In these lessons I found parallels to the human heart, resilient, yet tender, capable of growth even amidst loss. Eleanor's care for the garden was a testament to this resilience. Despite the challenges her health presented, she remained deeply invested in nurturing the life around her, a reflection of her enduring spirit. Her eyes still sparkled with that familiar mischief when a stubborn weed was pulled or a new sprout appeared, a reminder that joy could be found in the smallest victories. One afternoon, As the sky turned a muted gray and the first whispers of rain began to fall, Eleanor invited me inside to look at a box she had kept hidden away. Inside were photographs and mementos from her travels, postcards from far-flung places, ticket stubs from concerts and plays, letters written in careful script. It was a glimpse into the rich tapestry of her life beyond the garden, a reminder of the adventures and passions that had shaped her soul. She spoke softly of the places she still longed to see, the experiences she wished she could relive. There was a bittersweet quality to these reflections, a mixture of gratitude and longing that touched something deep within me. I realized then that while our shared garden was a place of growth and healing, it was also a sanctuary from the ache of missed opportunities and faded dreams. Together, we created a space where past and present coexisted, where hope for the future was tempered by acceptance of the now. As autumn deepened, Eleanor's health took a turn that made the reality of our time together even more palpable. The gentle strength she had shown began to give way to moments of fatigue and uncertainty. I became her steady anchor, managing appointments, medications, and the daily care that had become necessary. There were days when the weight of it all felt heavy, when the garden outside seemed a distant memory, and the quiet of the house pressed in with its own kind of loneliness. Yet even in these challenging times, Eleanor's spirit remained unbroken. She faced each day with a courage that inspired me, refusing to let illness define her. Our conversations shifted to deeper truths about mortality, love, and the meaning of a life well lived. We spoke frankly about fears and hopes, about the legacy we wanted to leave behind. It was in these conversations that I saw the fullness of her soul, the beauty and complexity of a woman who had lived deeply and loved fiercely. Through it all, the garden continued to be a place of solace and connection. I tended it carefully, mindful of Eleanor's wishes, while she found comfort in watching the changing colors and textures from her chair by the window. The garden became a metaphor for our shared journey, a reminder that life in all its beauty and impermanence is something to be cherished and nurtured. Even as the leaves fell and the earth prepared for winter, there was a quiet promise of renewal. I found myself reflecting often on the ways in which Eleanor had changed my understanding of love, not as a possession or a destination, but as a living, breathing presence that grows in moments of kindness, vulnerability, and grace. Our story was not one of grand declarations or dramatic twists, but of steady, enduring companionship that nourished the soul as the first snowflakes drifted gently to the ground. I sat beside Eleanor and held her hand, feeling the warmth of a bond that had deepened beyond words. In that moment, I knew that what we had cultivated was a rare and precious gift, love that transcended the ordinary, that embraced both joy and sorrow with equal tenderness. It was a love that had watered not only a garden but two hearts, leaving an imprint that would endure long after the seasons had changed. And as the world outside slipped into winter's quiet embrace, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey we had shared, for the lessons learned, and for the love that had blossomed quietly but irrevocably between us. Winter settled over the small town with a hush that blanketed every street and tree in a soft layer of snow. The garden, once bursting with color and life, now lay dormant. Beneath the frost, its bare branches reaching skyward like delicate lacework against the pale gray sky. The transformation outside mirrored the changes within our lives as the cold months forced us slowing down, an inward turning that brought both challenges and moments of quiet reflection. Eleanor's health, fragile as the thin ice on the garden pond, demanded constant care and attention. The once vibrant woman who had tended her plants with such passion now found herself reliant on others for the simplest tasks, her body growing weaker even as her spirit remained bright and unyielding. I became her constant companion, moving seamlessly between the roles of caregiver, friend, and witness to a life nearing its autumnal close. The house filled with the scent of pine from the wreath Eleanor had placed by the door, a reminder that even in the coldest season, life held its own kind of beauty and meaning. Our days began with the soft glow of morning light filtering through frost-kissed windows. I would help Eleanor to the kitchen, where the warmth of tea and the comfort of shared breakfast provided a gentle start. Despite the hardships, we clung to the small rituals that had become the anchors of our routine, checking on the garden's protective coverings, arranging fresh flowers brought in from a nearby florist, and sharing stories to keep our hearts connected. These moments, though simple, held profound significance, weaving a thread of continuity through the uncertainty that winter brought. Elena's voice, though sometimes frail, carried the wisdom of decades lived fully and the quiet grace of acceptance. She spoke often of the garden, of how the promise of spring always followed winter's rest, and how life, like the earth, renewed itself in cycles. Her words offered solace, reminding me that even in loss, there was hope and the possibility of new beginnings. As the days passed, the house became a cocoon of sorts, filled with soft blankets, flickering candles, and the gentle hum of the heating stove. The outside world, with its biting cold and swirling snow, seemed distant and unimportant compared to the intimate universe we inhabited. We spent hours in quiet companionship, sometimes reading aloud from old books, other times simply sitting side by side, our hands intertwined. In these shared silences, a deep bond flourished, one that transcended the need for words and rested in the comfort of presence. I found myself marveling at the depth of connection that had grown between us, not a love defined by passion or grand gestures, but a steady, unshakable devotion born of shared vulnerability and trust. It was a love that honored the complexities of aging and loss, embracing the fragile beauty of each moment. One afternoon, as a snowstorm raged outside, Eleanor asked me to help her with a task she had been putting off for some time. She wanted to write letters to old friends and family members, messages of gratitude, forgiveness, and remembrance. Together, we gathered stationery, pens, and photographs, and I sat beside her as she carefully penned each note, her handwriting. Though shaky, was deliberate and full of meaning, each word carrying the weight of a lifetime of experiences. As she wrote, she shared stories behind the letters, recollections of laughter and tears, of love lost and found, of lessons learned. Through hardship and joy, these moments were poignant reminders of the power of connection, of the importance of reaching out even as the future grew uncertain. The act of writing became a healing ritual, a way to honor the past while facing the present with courage and grace. Throughout the winter weeks, I witnessed Eleanor's strength and fragility in equal measure. There were days when her eyes sparkled with the same mischievous light I'd come to adore, moments when laughter filled the room and the weight of illness lifted, if only briefly. There were also times when fatigue and pain silenced her voice, and I became the steady hand guiding her through the darkness. In those quiet hours, I felt the full magnitude of the bond we shared, a connection forged not only in joy, but in the willingness to stand beside one another in suffering. Our relationship had become a sanctuary, a place where fear and hope coexisted, where the heart could open wide despite the inevitability of loss. I learned that love, in its truest form, is not about holding on too tightly, but about allowing space for growth, change, and ultimately letting go. The garden, though hidden beneath snow and ice, remained a symbol of resilience and renewal. I spent time clearing paths and reinforcing beds in preparation for spring, imagining the burst of color and life that would follow the barren months. Tending the garden became a meditation, a way to honor Eleanor's legacy and the love we had nurtured together. Each seed I planted was an act of faith, a belief that even after winter's harshness, life would bloom again. This hope sustained me through long nights and difficult days, a reminder that endings are never truly final, but part of a larger cycle. In caring for the garden, I cared for the memory of Eleanor's spirit, ensuring that her influence would continue to inspire growth and beauty beyond her time. As the holiday season approached, we adapted traditions to suit our changed circumstances. Instead of large gatherings, we celebrated quietly with warm meals, soft music, and the simple joy of being together. Eleanor's favorite carols played softly in the background as we decorated the house with handmade ornaments and twinkling lights. There was a bittersweet quality to these moments, mingling of gratitude for the present and sadness for what was slipping away. Yet even amidst the tears, there was laughter and tenderness, a testament to the enduring strength of the human heart. We exchanged small gifts, tokens of affection and remembrance, and shared stories that spanned generations. These celebrations, intimate and heartfelt, deepened our connection and reinforced the meaning we found in each other's company. One evening, as the fire crackled softly and the wind howled outside, Eleanor reached out to hold my hand. Her touch was light but steady, a reassurance that spoke volumes without words. In that quiet moment, I understood that our journey together was nearing its close, but that the love we had cultivated would live on. It's nourished by memory and the enduring bond of friendship. We spoke of dreams and wishes for the future, of the legacy we hoped to leave behind. Eleanor expressed a desire for the garden to remain a place of peace and healing, open to all who sought solace in its embrace. I promised to honor that wish, knowing that in tending the garden, I would continue to honor her. Our conversation was a farewell and a beginning, a recognition that while life is finite, the heart's capacity for love is boundless. As winter deepened and the days grew shortest, I found comfort in the routines we had established, in the quiet strength of our companionship. The garden lay beneath its blanket of snow, resting and renewing in anticipation of spring. Eleanor rested beside me, her breathing steady and calm, her presence a source of profound peace. In the stillness of those final weeks, I felt the fullness of our shared journey, a testament to the power of love to transform, to heal, and to endure beyond the confines of time. And when the moment came to say goodbye, I held her hand with gratitude and tenderness, knowing that our story was far from over. It would live on in the garden's bloom, in the memories we shared, and in the hearts of those who loved her. Spring arrived quietly, its arrival almost unnoticed beneath the early morning mist that clung to the garden like a secret. The snow melted slowly, revealing the earth beneath in shades of damp brown and soft green, promising new life and beginnings after the long dormancy of winter. I found myself drawn to the garden every day, feeling an unspoken connection to Eleanor. As I tended to the beds where she had spent so many hours, the soil was cool and rich, the scent of damp earth filling the air as I gently turned the ground, removing debris and preparing for the seeds and plants that would soon take root. There was a solemn joy in this work, a quiet honoring of the cycle of life and death that had shaped our recent months. With each seed I planted, I whispered hopes for renewal and growth, imagining Eleanor's smile as the colors bloomed and the garden thrived once more. It was a form of conversation without words, a way to keep her presence alive in the space she loved. The house. With each seed I planted, I whispered hopes for renewal and growth, imagining Eleanor's smile as the colors bloomed and the garden thrived once more. It was a form of conversation without words, a way to keep her presence alive in the space she loved. The house felt emptier without her laughter and voice, but I filled the silence with memories, stories, and the rhythms of daily life that continued despite loss. I found solace in the routine of caring for the garden, where life's persistent pulse could be felt beneath the surface. Neighbors stopped by from time to time, offering condolences and sharing stories of Eleanor that I had not known. These shared recollections became a patchwork quilt of memories, each piece adding depth and warmth to the legacy she left behind. In their words, Eleanor lived on, not just in the garden or the house, but in the hearts of everyone whose life she had touched. I listened closely, feeling grateful for the chance to know her and humbled by the love she inspired. It was a reminder that even as one chapter closes, another begins. Carried forward by the lives we influence, as the weeks passed and the garden burst into color, I began to invite friends and neighbors to visit. The space became a gathering place, a sanctuary for those seeking comfort and connection. We shared tea on the back porch, our conversations flowing easily like the gentle breeze that stirred the blossoms. The garden was no longer just a project or a memory. It had become a living testament to resilience, hope, and community. Each flower that bloomed seemed to echo Eleanor's spirit, vibrant and enduring. I took great care to maintain the gardens, beauty, pruning, watering, and nurturing each plant as if it were a fragile promise of tomorrow. In doing so, I found healing for my own heart, which still carried the ache of loss alongside the warmth of cherished memories. One afternoon, while tending the rose bushes, I noticed a young woman watching from the garden gate. Her eyes held a mixture of curiosity and reverence, and when I invited her in, she smiled shyly. Stepping into the sunlight that filtered through the trees, she introduced herself as Lily, a new neighbor who had recently moved to the area seeking peace after her own difficult year. She told me how she had heard about Eleanor's garden and was drawn by the stories of kindness and friendship that had blossomed there. We talked for hours, sharing our experiences of love and loss, hope and healing. Lily's presence was a balm to my soul, her openness and sincerity rekindling a spark of connection that I had thought lost. In her, I saw the promise of new beginnings, the continuation of the cycle that Eleanor had taught me to cherish. Together, we began to plan community events in the garden, a place where people could come to reflect, to celebrate, or simply to find a moment of peace. We hosted poetry readings, small concerts, and gardening workshops, each gathering weaving a new thread into the fabric of the neighborhood. The garden became a living classroom, a place of learning and growth not just for plants, but for hearts and minds. Children ran freely among the flowers, their laughter ringing like bells in the air. Elderly neighbors found comfort on benches shaded by blossoming trees, their conversations a gentle hum of shared history and wisdom. It was as if Eleanor's dream had taken on a life of its own, blossoming in ways she could never have imagined. And through it all, felt her presence a guiding light that encouraged me to nurture not just the garden, but the connections that gave life meaning. As summer approached, the garden reached its full glory. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and lavender, the colors of vibrant tapestry of reds, pinks, yellows, and purples. Bees hummed busily from flower to flower, and butterflies danced in the sunlight, adding their delicate beauty to the scene. The garden was a symphony of life, a place where time seemed to slow and worries melted away. I spent hours there each day, feeling a profound sense of peace and purpose. The work was hard but fulfilling, each task a meditation on growth and care. As I planted new varieties of flowers and tended to the established beds, I thought of Eleanor's words about renewal and the enduring power of love. The garden was no longer just a memory, it was a living legacy, a gift to the world that carried her spirit forward. In the evenings, I often sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon and the sky transform into a canvas of oranges and pinks. These quiet moments became times of reflection, when I could feel the fullness of the journey I had been on, from a chance encounter watering a garden to the deep bonds forged in love, loss, and friendship. I thought about the lessons Eleanor had taught me, the importance of kindness, the strength found in vulnerability, and the beauty of allowing the heart to open even when it risks pain. Her story had become intertwined with mine, shaping who I was and who I aspired to be. And though she was no longer physically present, her influence was woven into every petal, every leaf, and every breath of wind that stirred the garden. Life moved forward, marked by new seasons, new faces, and new stories. The garden remained a constant, sanctuary where the past and present converged in a celebration of life's fragile, precious beauty. I found myself becoming a keeper of stories, a guardian of memories, and a nurturer of hope. And in that role, I discovered a purpose that transcended the ordinary, calling to cultivate not just plants, but the hearts of those who came seeking comfort, connection, and renewal. Eleanor's wish had become my mission, a promise to water not just the garden, but the hearts of all who crossed its threshold. Through this, I found healing for myself and a way to honor the love that had forever changed my life. Late summer brought with it a golden haze that lingered in the air, warm and forgiving, as if the world itself had exhaled after the heaviness of spring's grief and the fervor of early summer's rebirth. The garden, now mature in its seasonal bloom, stood as a quiet monument to everything that had passed and all that continued to unfold. I had grown into the rhythm of my days, the ebb and flow of garden life seeping into my bones and offering a kind of peace I hadn't known before. There was comfort in repetition, in the soft rasp of pruning shears, the rustle of leaves, in a lazy breeze, the hum of bees, as steady and certain as breath. My hands had become calloused and strong, the muscles in my back constantly sore but satisfied, because every gesture, every turn of the soil or lifting of a watering can felt like a conversation with Eleanor. The garden had not only become her resting spirit, but a mirror of my internal world, untamed in places, structured in others, and always somehow growing. The routine didn't erase the ache. Loss isn't a wound that closes neatly, nor is love a thing one simply carries and then sets down, weaves into your identity, alters the way you move through space and relate to time. Eleanor's memory was a constant presence, not in a haunting way, but in the gentle manner of someone who had left their fingerprints on everything you touch. Her voice surfaced in my mind in the oddest places: when I planted bulbs for next spring, when I paused beside the rosemary bush that had somehow survived the frost, when I rearranged the stones along the garden's edge, just so. These were her instincts, her sensibilities now blended with mine, as if I had inherited not just the garden but her essence. It made me wonder how often, in the natural course of life, we become repositories for others' dreams and rituals without realizing it. Her wisdom had rooted itself in me. My conversations with Lily became a steady presence as well, though we approached one another gently, as if instinctively aware of the delicate line between companionship and intrusion. She would stop by in the late afternoons after her work was done, sometimes with fresh bread or strawberries from the market, and we'd walk through the rows of sunflowers and cosmos, talking quietly. Her laughter was light, and her thoughts deep, often surprising me with insights that seemed far older than her years. She carried her own grief too, though she spoke of it rarely just fragments of a failed relationship, a strained family tie, and a need to find something real in a world that felt increasingly distant. In the garden, she said, she had found that it gave her something to believe in. I watched her grow more comfortable in the space, her fingers learning the language of the soil, her eyes brightening in the way of someone who had begun to feel at home in the world again. Her presence reminded me that healing was not always loud or dramatic. It was often found in the quiet returns, the patient repetitions of tending and waiting, as the sun grew lower in the sky each day, casting long shadows across the flower beds. I began to prepare for the autumn season. The garden, always in flux, was already beginning to hint at its next transformation. Leaves turned the slightest shades of amber and rust, and the evening air carried a coolness that hadn't been there before. I felt a strange mix of anticipation and melancholy. Change was coming again, as it always did. The garden taught me that nothing stayed forever, and trying to hold on to one state of being was like cupping water in your hands. You cherish it while it's there. One evening, Lily brought an old camera and asked if she could take photos of the garden. She said she wanted to capture the way it made her feel. I watched as she moved through the beds, crouching low to catch the angle of sunlight through petals, leaning in to get the close details of a bee perched on a bloom. Her focus was intense but soft, and I realized that this was her form of reverence, her way of seeing and preserving what mattered. The camera clicked softly, like a heartbeat. Later, she showed me the photos, and I was stunned by how she had managed to capture not just the beauty of the space, but its emotional texture, the sense of stillness, the traces of memory, the layered presence of time. It made me see the garden anew through her eyes. I was reminded that sometimes we need others to reflect back to us the sacredness of what we've created. We decided to print some of the photos and hang them inside the house, turning the hallway into a gallery of seasons past and present. Image carried with it a story of Eleanor, of me, of the silent evolution of this place that had come to define so much. The project stirred something in me. I began writing again, just little notes at first, captions for the photos, descriptions of certain blooms, but soon the words flowed more freely: short essays, reflections, even poetry. I hadn't written creatively in years, and now it came as naturally as breathing. The garden wasn't just a space to tend anymore. It had become a muse, a sacred wellspring of meaning. The act of creating, whether through photography or prose, felt like a necessary extension of the love that had taken root here. Eleanor's story, my own, and now Lily's tooth, they all intertwined. like vines growing up the same trellis, distinct but connected by my no-dogs. The community began asking if we would host another gathering. The memory of last season's small concerts and poetry readings still lingered, and people wanted to return to that sense of connection. I was hesitant at first. The grief was still fresh, and I wasn't sure I could share the garden in that way again. But Lily reminded me that healing deepens when shared, that by opening the garden to others, we allowed them to bring their own stories and find comfort in the common soil. So we planned an early autumn harvest evening, complete with music, readings, and a long table where neighbors could bring dishes to share. The day arrived with golden skies and soft breezes. As people filtered in, I watched the space come alive again, not just with voices and movement, but with gratitude. There were tears, yes, and stories exchanged over food and laughter, but, more than that, there was a collective exhale, as if the entire neighborhood had needed this moment of communion. I gave a short speech as the sun began to set. Standing in the garden center with Lily at my side, I spoke of Eleanor, of her death, but of her life, how her love had grown this place into something that could outlast her. I spoke of resilience, of how beauty often grows in the cracks left by sorrow, and how we too must keep planting, even when the harvest is uncertain. There was a hush after I finished, the kind of silence that holds reverence. Then someone began to clap, and the sound spread, soft but certain, like rain on a rooftop. I looked at the garden, at the faces, illuminated by lantern light, and I felt something shift inside me, a kind of completion, a full circle, the kind that only comes after you've lived through something, come out the other side with your hands dirty and your heart. Somehow fuller than before, the air had taken on the unmistakable crispness of approaching fall, and with it came a certain stillness in the mornings, a kind of pause between the pulse of summer and the hush of winter. I noticed it most when I stepped into the garden before the sun fully rose. The soil cool underfoot, the flowers half asleep, and the birds not yet convinced to sing. This liminal time of year always made me reflective, perhaps more so now that the garden had become not only a space of labor and life, but of memory, and perhaps even redemption. Eleanor's presence lingered like mist in these hours, not as a sharp pain, but as a tender echo. I found myself pausing more, not just to tend, but to witness, to take in the way the asters clung to their purple bloom despite the colder air, how the ornamental grasses shimmered in the slanting light, and how the garden had subtly shifted in its palette. Like a painting surrendering to dusk, the harvest gathering had left behind its own imprint. For days afterward, I received visits from neighbors who lingered at the gate, sharing how the evening had brought something back to them, a lost connection, forgotten joy, or even just a sense of calm they hadn't felt in months. It made me realize that while I had viewed the garden primarily through the lens of Eleanor's legacy and my own healing, others saw it as something larger, a kind of sanctuary that transcended personal story. It was a reminder that even when we create from a place of grief, what grows can be of service to many. I started to think differently about what it meant to be a steward, not just of land, but of a space where people could come and quietly mend something within themselves. The garden had expanded beyond its borders. Lily and I continued our rhythm, though something had begun to shift subtly between us, not in a way that brought discomfort, but in that unspoken tension that arises when two people have grown used to each other's presence and must now reckon with what that closeness means. We never spoke of it directly, but it hung in the quiet between our conversations, in the way our hands would nearly touch when passing tools. The glances held a fraction longer than necessary. I found myself wondering if I was reading too much into it, if my mind, softened by months of emotional vulnerability, was inventing stories where there were none. But then, on a late September afternoon, we stood at the edge of the garden, where the dahlias bloomed in brilliant defiance of the season's waning heat, and she turned to me with a look that held the weight of unasked questions. Her eyes didn't waver, and in that moment, I understood. She had been waiting for me to acknowledge it, to give language to the thing growing between us, just as we had named each plant and nurtured each seed. Still, I hesitated. Love after loss is a strange and delicate terrain. I had loved Eleanor deeply, in a way that had shaped me permanently. To open myself again felt both disloyal and liberating, as though I were betraying something sacred while also honoring it by daring to live fully again. I spent that evening alone in the garden, sitting on the stone bench Eleanor and I had placed years ago beneath the fig tree. I let the silence stretch long and unbroken, listening to the sounds of crickets and the distant rustling of trees. I thought about the nature of love, how it doesn't replace what came before, but layers itself over the past, like petals falling softly onto soil. Not erasing, but enriching. I thought about Lily, about the way her laughter had brightened this place, how her presence had slowly drawn me back to a fuller version of myself. The realization came gently, not like a lightning bolt, but like dawn, inevitable, slow, and sure, I could love again, not in the same way, not with the same history, but with the same heart, only wiser now. The next day, found her in the garden before I even reached the back gate. She was kneeling beside the marigolds, her hair pulled back, her hands deep in the earth, completely absorbed. I didn't speak right away. I just watched her, this woman who had wandered into my life with a broken camera and a kind heart, and who had stayed not out of need but out of choice. When she looked up and saw me, her expression shifted, not startled, but aware, as if she had been expecting this moment. I walked toward her, not needing a speech, just presence. With the simplest words can we talk? We began the slow unraveling of everything we had held back, spoke of fear, of timing, of the sacredness of what we had already shared. There was no grand declaration, just an honest conversation under a soft gray sky, and the understanding that we would move forward gently, with care and intention. In the weeks that followed, we didn't try to define what we were. There was no rush, no labels pressed onto something that didn't yet require them. Instead, we simply spent time together, harvesting the last of the tomatoes, planting garlic for next year, organizing a seed swap with the neighbors. Her laughter was more frequent, my sleep more restful. We began to plan a new section of the garden for spring, something that would be uniquely ours, a circular patch near the back, lined with lavender and sage, with a bench nestled in the center. It felt symbolic, this idea of creating something not tied to the past, not a continuation of Eleanor's vision, but a new chapter. It didn't erase what had come before. It honored it by building upon it. One morning, as we sipped coffee by the small fire pit, Lily mentioned how the garden had taught her to live differently. She spoke of patience, of learning to let go, of how watching things grow and die and return had shifted her relationship with control. I nodded, understanding deeply. We were both becoming people shaped not just by our pain, but by our response to it. The garden had changed us not instantly or dramatically, but incrementally, day by day, in the quiet, enduring way that only nature can. And in that transformation, we found each other, not as saviors or substitutes, but as companions, on parallel paths. There was a moment in early October when the first frost hit unexpectedly. Many of the late bloomers wilted overnight, their petals curling inward, their stems bending in surrender. I walked through the garden early that morning, a blanket over, my shoulders, breath visible in the chill air. It could have felt like a loss, but instead I saw it as a rite of passage. The garden was teaching its final lesson of the year, that beauty doesn't fear endings, that every falling leaf is a promise of return, that letting go is not the opposite of love, but its continuation. Lily joined me a little later, wrapping her scarf tighter as she stepped beside me. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The frost clung to the world around us like a fragile blessing, and in the stillness, I felt something inside me settle. We stood together, watching the light break through the trees, and in that moment, everything felt whole. Autumn deepened like a slow exhale, casting the garden in rich tones of copper, amber, and deep maroon. The air smelled of fading leaves and earth, a scent that stirred memory and instinct all at once. I moved slower now, not out of age or fatigue, but because the rhythm of the season invited it. There was no urgency in the garden now, no demands. Beyond what had already been sown and grown, even the soil seemed to rest, as if preparing itself for winter's long slumber. I found that I mirrored it without meaning, to quieting the pace of my thoughts, taking more time to simply be, letting each moment land fully before moving on. I would step out just after dawn and wander through the rows with no intention but to observe. And that simple act of bearing witness made me feel deeply connected to something far larger than myself. The plants, even in their decline, held a kind of grace. Echinacea, once tall and vibrant, now bowed with seed-heavy heads, their petals dried and curling inward like old parchment. The sunflowers, which had stood as cheerful sentinels all summer, now leaned wearily against one another, their golden crowns dulled and disheveled, but still noble. Even the squash vines, tangled and brittle, carried within them the satisfaction of a season well spent. There was no shame in their unraveling, only completion. And this the garden taught me a new kind of reverence, not just for what flourishes, but for what fades with dignity. It was a quiet, profound kind of beauty that I had once overlooked in my youth. Too focused then on the vivid and alive, Lily and I grew into a gentle companionship that felt grounded and real, as if we were two people slowly remembering what it meant to trust time again. We didn't speak often about what we were becoming. We didn't need to. The garden gave us the space to exist together without the pressure of answers. We spent hours working side by side, sometimes in silence, sometimes in light conversation that drifted into laughter or long pauses of thoughtfulness. She had started sketching the plants now, not just photographing them, and I would often find her perched on the stone wall, pencil in hand, eyes tracing the shapes of withered blooms with the attention of someone trying to understand their essence, not just their form. Her sketches were delicate and expressive, filled with the imperfections of life, and I began to see the garden through yet another lens, one filtered through her art and emotion. We also began reading aloud in the evenings. It started with poetry, mostly Mary Oliver and Wendell Berry. Their lines rich with natural imagery and emotional restraint, and then slowly expanded into journals, letters, and essays we both found tucked into old books. We would sit in the garden's small greenhouse, which I had recently reinforced with clear plastic panels to hold in the warmth. A small heater kept the space comfortable, and candles flickered along the shelves, casting a soft light on Lily's face as she read. There was something about hearing words spoken in that sacred space, surrounded by dormant vines and quiet tools, that felt ancient and intimate. It reminded me that stories had always lived in the soil, that language and land were bound together in ways we rarely recognize. One evening, she read a passage about the Japanese concept of wabi-sabi, the beauty of things imperfect, impermanent, and incomplete, and I felt something settle in my chest. That idea, so simple and yet so profound, captured everything the garden had been showing me. I looked around at the cracked clay pots, the uneven rows, the compost heap steaming gently in the cool night, and I saw not disorder but harmony, even. Grief, in that light, became something with its own kind of grace, a testament to love. Yes, but also a testament to having risked loving at all. The community continued to visit the garden, though less frequently now that the colder weather discouraged lingering. Still, a few familiar faces would show up with thermoses of tea or baskets of apples, and I always welcomed them. I had started keeping a small journal at the garden's gate, a simple book where visitors could write thoughts, memories, or reflections. It was Lily's idea, and I hadn't expected much from it, but the entries quickly accumulated into something meaningful. Some wrote about their own gardens, others about lost loved ones. A few simply described how the garden made them feel: peaceful, hopeful, less alone. Damn. Reading those pages became a quiet ritual for me, a way of remembering that even in silence, connection continued. The garden was not just a place of memory, it was now a place of communion. Lily's presence had altered the house in quiet ways too. Her coat hung next to mine by the door. Her sketchbooks rested on the kitchen table beside my seed catalogs. She had brought a small radio that played softly while we cooked, mostly jazz or classical, though sometimes she would put on an old folk record and hum along. These subtle signs of her made the house feel alive again, not because it had been empty before, but because it now held shared breath, shared routines. We cooked together most nights, trading off tasks. And sometimes we ate in silence, content in the cadence of a day well lived. I didn't realize until then how much I had missed simple domestic rituals, the comfort of another person's footsteps. In the next room, the warmth of a mug passed from one hand to another, the quiet glance that said more than words ever could. And yet, there were moments when I would retreat into myself, unannounced and unexplained. It was not because I doubted what we were becoming, but because grief still lived in me, quiet and watchful. Lily never took offense. She understood the contours of loss, the way it resurfaced unexpectedly like a sudden chill. When she sensed my distance, she simply gave me space, sometimes leaving me a note or a small drawing at the door of the greenhouse. I once found a sketch of Eleanor's bench, drawn from memory, with the caption, "A place where love continues." I stared at it for a long time, the tears slow and unforced. It was not just a gesture of empathy, it was an act of love. As November approached, we began preparing the garden for winter. It was time to cut back the perennials, cover the beds with mulch, and store the tools. These tasks, once a symbol of endings, now felt like a promise. Everything we tucked away carried the knowledge that it would return, transformed. The bulbs we planted now would not emerge until spring, but their work had already begun deep below. The surface, that hidden labor, that unseen faith in renewal, moved me more than I could say. I found myself whispering thanks as I covered each bed, not just for the blooms of this year, but for the lessons they had offered, the healing they had made possible. One afternoon, as we closed up the greenhouse for the season, Lily paused and looked out over the garden. The light was soft, the kind of light that stretches shadows and makes even the bare branches look luminous. She said quietly, "Do you ever think she planned all of this? That somehow she knew you'd keep this going and that I'd find my way here?" I didn't answer right away. I thought of Eleanor's last season, of her final instructions written in the margins of her garden journal. It's the way she had looked at me when she asked me to keep watering, even when it hurt. I thought of the improbable series of events that had brought Lily here, the shared silences that had become understanding. Maybe not planned, I said finally, but hoped for. Wished into the soil, maybe? She smiled, and in that moment, the garden fading but full felt like the truest home I had ever known. December crept in with a quiet elegance, draping the garden in layers of frost that sparkled beneath the morning sun like shattered glass. Scattered across the soil, the once colorful beds now slumbered under a blanket of mulch. Their outlines softened and obscured, their work taking place in silence beneath the frozen earth. The days were short and hushed, the evenings long and contemplative. Inside the house, the windows glowed against the early darkness, each room holding its own kind of warmth. The garden had finally yielded to the season, but even in its rest, it pulsed with life and suspension.
Ow.
I had come to understand that dormancy was not death, but preparation, a waiting made sacred by its purpose. The more I observed it, the more I saw my own story mirrored in that quiet. Lily had returned to the city for a few weeks to care for her sister, who was recovering from a minor surgery. The house once again had only my footsteps in it, and though I missed her, I did not feel the old aching loneliness. Her presence lingered in ways I had not anticipated in the half-read book left open on the armchair. The smell of her peppermint tea still faint in the kitchen air, a small drawing of frost-covered lavender she had pinned above the mantel before leaving. Each object was a reminder not just of her, but of the connection we had nurtured slowly, deliberately, and without pressure. I found comfort in these traces, in the understanding that love didn't always require proximity to endure. Without the usual tasks of planting, weeding, and harvesting to consume my days, I turned inward. I spent more time in the greenhouse, now quiet and stripped down, with only a few overwintering herbs and the scent of dried thyme lingering in the corners. I organized tools, labeled seeds saved from the fall, and started drafting ideas for new beds in the spring. But more than anything, I wrote. Something about the stillness of winter loosened a part of me that had long been held tight. I began writing not just about the garden, but about Eleanor, about my first years in this house, about the people who had shaped my life before I knew their impact. It was not planned, and I didn't know where it would lead, but the words came, like water finding cracks in stone. Each memory unearthed something else, some tender, some painful, all of them necessary. Sometimes I would walk the garden paths just before dusk, wrapped in my thickest coat, hands deep in my pockets. The air would sting my cheeks, and my boots would crunch against the thin ice forming along the edges of the flagstones. I found I could still see the shapes of things. Even in their absence, the arch of the sunflowers long gone, the skeletal remains of the grape arbor, the subtle rise where the daffodils would push through first. These ghosts of growth did not haunt me. Instead, they reminded me of time's generosity, how it allowed us to revisit the past, not just in pain but in reverence. It felt right that the garden rested now. It had done so much for me, for Lily, and for the quiet parade of neighbors who had passed through its gate over the past months. Now it deserved this pause, this deep exhale. On the third Sunday of the month, I received a small envelope in the mail with Lily's familiar handwriting. Inside was a pressed leaf, perfectly preserved in its golden red veins, and a short note: "The trees here have almost all let go. I've never noticed how beautiful their surrender is until now.
Thinking
Of you and your quiet garden." I read it twice, then again, and finally tucked it into my garden journal, where I had begun pasting other small mementos of petal from the last rose of autumn. Sketch Lily had made of the beehive in summer, a photograph of Eleanor in her favorite straw hat, taken during the garden's first full season. That journal had grown thick now, almost bursting, and every page was a testament to change not just in the garden, but within myself. As the solstice approached and the year threatened to turn over once again, I found myself reflecting not on resolutions, but on rhythms. What the garden had taught me most clearly was that nothing stayed and nothing stayed gone. That every death was part of some deeper becoming. I had resisted this for years, clinging tightly to what had been out of fear of what might not return. But now, I understood that letting go was not about forgetting it. It was about making space. And in that space, something new could grow. Something like grace, something like love. Return to you in a different form, under a different name, in a different season, but still love all the same. The first snow came quietly in the night, blanketing the yard in soft white without so much as a whisper. I woke early, before the sun had fully risen, and stood at the window in silence, watching the world turn new again under that hushed cover. The garden was a single smooth sheet of white, hiding all signs of beds and paths, as though the past season had been folded gently beneath a page of peace. The grape arbor stood like a skeleton against the dim light, every beam traced with frost, each curve of iron catching glimmers of pale gold as the morning crept in. I didn't move right away. There was something sacred in that stillness, something that asked for reverence. For a long while, I just stood there, letting the silence say more than I ever could. Later that day, I bundled myself against the cold and walked the perimeter of the garden, the crunch of my boots marking my presence. In a world otherwise untouched, the bird feeders were busy with chickadees and juncos, darting in and out, their feathers puffed for warmth, their songs high and sharp like silver needles in the air. I refilled the seed trays, swept away some snow from the stone bench near the rosemary bed, and lingered there, watching the breath drift from my mouth in clouds. The greenhouse held its own quiet life inside basil, clinging to green in defiance of the frost. A few pots of rosemary and thyme lining the shelves. Lit the small space heater and let it hum beside me as I sat in the old metal chair Eleanor had once painted sky blue. Even now, even in winter, I felt her presence most strongly in that room, in the smell of soil, the familiar rust of tools, the tiny miracles of stubborn green that bloomed in the heart of cold. By mid-afternoon, the sun emerged weakly, scattering light across the glass and casting long shadows through the yard. I heard the crunch of tires in the drive before I saw the car. Lily was back. She stepped out in a long coat, her breath pluming in the air as she looked at me with a quiet smile.
Ow.
I met her halfway, our hands finding each other like they'd never parted. She said she missed the quiet of this place, the peace she didn't know she'd been craving until it was gone. I said nothing, only nodded, and together we walked back into the greenhouse. She commented on the stubborn basil, ran her fingers over the leaves like a violinist testing strings. I watched her, watched the way she moved through the space, as if she belonged there because she did. That evening, over bowls of hot stew and thick slices of sourdough, we talked about her sister's recovery, the city noise, the way winter felt different in every place. She told me she'd been writing essays mostly in that she wanted to stay through the holidays if I was willing. I was more than willing. I think, in truth, I'd been waiting for her return in ways I didn't quite understand until she stood there again in front of me. The house felt full with her there, not just physically but emotionally, spiritually, like something once out of balance had finally realigned. We made no declarations, no decisions, but when she reached across the table to touch my hand, there was a promise and a quiet understanding that neither of us needed to say out loud. This winter would be different from the last. It's not lonelier, but softer. Not silent, but shared. The days that followed passed like a gentle breath, unhurried and quiet. Each one stitched together with the kind of warmth that doesn't need words to be understood. Lily settled into the rhythms of the house like she'd never left. There was a comfort in our silence. In the way we moved through the kitchen without bumping into each other, in how she folded the laundry while I stacked firewood by the porch, in the soft murmur of her voice reading aloud from a book in the evening. Winter outside was sharp and clean, skies streaked with steel-gray icicles forming like glass daggers beneath the eaves. But inside, we lived in a hush of slow mornings and shared soups and late-night cocoa by the fire. Lily's presence softened everything like a watercolor wash over a rough sketch. She wrote often in the mornings, her fingers dancing quietly over the keys of her old laptop. The only sound, the occasional creak of the chair or the soft scrape of her mug on the wooden table. I never asked what she wrote. I didn't need to. The way she smiled after finishing a paragraph, the way she sometimes reached across to squeeze my hand, told me enough. One afternoon, while the snow fell outside in heavy, drifting flakes, Lily suggested we dig through the attic. She'd seen me looking for something the week before and thought it might be a good excuse to sort things out. I hadn't been up there in years, not since before Eleanor passed, and I wasn't sure what we'd find. But there was something about the way Lily asked, playful, curious, that made me want to open that old hatch and climb the creaking steps. We found boxes of forgotten holiday decorations, yellowed photo albums, a stack of gardening magazines from the early 2000s, and a shoebox filled with old letters Eleanor had kept, some from friends, others from me, dated and folded, still smelling faintly of lavender and thyme. Lily read a few aloud, her voice catching once or twice, not from sadness, but from the weight of tenderness. Later that night, sat by the fire while she worked on a new piece, her fingers moving slowly, thoughtfully, her brow creased in concentration. I found myself watching her the way you might watch the snow, marveling at its beauty without needing to explain it. I didn't know what we were building or what it would look like in a year or 5, but I knew I didn't need to. What we had was honest, uncomplicated. It didn't lean on labels or expectations. It was a shared understanding. A hand reached out in the dark and another meeting it halfway. Lily looked up at one point, catching my gaze. Neither of us spoke. She just smiled, and I smiled back, and that was enough. Spring returned with a soft hand that brushed away the last of the frost, bringing with it the scent of thawing earth and the tender green of new beginnings. The garden, once a quiet memory beneath the snow, stirred back to life. Buds bloomed along the hedges, and the roses Lily had planted with careful precision were beginning to stretch toward the sunlight. We spent our mornings side by side, hands in the soil, letting the earth warm our fingers and our spirits. It wasn't just a garden anymore. It was a patchwork of every moment we'd shared, the quiet ones, tender ones, even the painful ones, all layered beneath the roots. In waiting to rise, Lily didn't move back in permanently, and I never asked her to. That decision was mutual, made not from fear, but from clarity. We had learned something rare and beautiful. Not all love needs to be tied up in ribbons or confined within walls. Some love exists in long walks down familiar roads and shared meals that ask nothing in return, in glances across a room where no words are needed. She still came by, often unannounced, and I never stopped smiling when I heard her footsteps on the porch. We'd water the garden together, sometimes in silence, sometimes talking about nothing at all. And once, as we stood there watching the sun fall behind the hills and the last drops from the hose landed in the soil, she turned to me and said, almost like a whisper carried on the breeze, "Thank you for watering my heart." I didn't need to respond. The garden bloomed wildly around us, and that was answer enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.